Welcome to the Futurebuild podcast. I'm Martin Hearn, event director of Futurebuild, and today's episode is called Unfinished Business, Duncan Baker-Brown on climate architecture and the fight for RIBA. Duncan was actually the very first guest we had on this podcast 2 years ago, and now 35 episodes later, he's back. Last time he was running for RIBA president, he unfortunately didn't win. This time he's running again with a campaign built around climate literacy, supporting architects, strengthening practice, and re-establishing the value of the profession. Duncan is also a friend, so this conversation will be a little bit different. It's not a manifesto reading, it's a chance to ask the honest questions, the one you can only ask someone you respect, support, and want to succeed. Duncan, welcome back.
Thank you, Martin. That was a lovely introduction. A nice little chat between the two of us. Has it been 2 years? Wow.
I know. Now, I'm calling this episode Unfinished Business. Does that seem fair?
That's good. Well, yeah, it does. I mean, with reference to my desires to be the next president of the RIBA, obviously the first time we spoke with one of these podcasts, it was the first time I ran. And I ran a very close race. I mean, I only lost by 110 votes, which when you consider there were potentially 48,000 people that could vote. Unfortunately, we only get about 10% of the people vote for whatever reason. But still, when you get about 5,000 people voting and only you lose by 110, it was very close. So I was always going to come again. I was always going to run again. But I think, not being part of the London scene is a bit of a disadvantage, but not much of one. I'm stuck here on the South Coast in Brighton. I ran Chris Williamson, the current president, really close. So, I'm really up for doing it.
Brilliant. I'm around 2 weeks out from Futurebuild, and unfortunately, it's one of the first that you didn't attend in many years. So, to get you back for that, I'm going to open this podcast with some very tough, quick-fire questions for you.
Okay, let's bring it on. Come on, I'm up for it.
So the first one is, your campaign says pulling architects first. Let's be honest, Duncan. Is that a campaign line or is it a rescue mission?
Yes. I mean, it's definitely a campaign line. I mean, where it comes from actually is that the RIBA's charter is all about putting architecture first. It's all about putting advancing architecture, not architects. And I think the RIBA has done a very good job with that since it was formed in 1838. So I think it does advance the quality and nature of architecture, but it doesn't do the same for its members. And if you think there's 48,000 members, the majority of us are in the regions, provincial towns. I'm in Brighton, I'm on the coast. And I think a lot of us feel a bit sort of out of touch with the RIBA, and we can't always see what it's doing for us. Having sat on council for 6 years, I can see what it does for us, but there's a sort of disconnect between the institution and its membership. And so from my point of view, if I focus on the membership and get that engaged with the institution more and vice versa, and make the RIBA more about its members, then I think the RIBA will be a lot healthier and a better place. And it will serve its members well, and members won't mind being charged the membership fee because it will be useful to them.
We're going to come on in a minute, actually, into your points about, what is the value of RIBA and those sort of questions. But not to bring up bad memories, but you ran before and lost. What do you think losing has taught you rather than probably what you would have learned by winning?
Go early. Announce that you're thinking about running for president before waiting for the starting pistol to go off. Last time I kept quiet. I was told, no, you mustn't mention anything about wanting, that you're going to run. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, 3 months before I was told that, Chris has made it clear he's thinking of running, and it's the phrase thinking of, which is, so I learned to go early. So this time, there's 4 candidates this year, and we were all announced in May. But I put in a few articles out in January, February, March, making it clear that I was thinking about running again. And I think that served me well this time. I feel like I've got more people engaged with my campaign, and it seems a lot busier. The other thing I did to sort of ensure that was to because I really am about the members. Since early March, I've been traveling every week to a different region. I've gone as far north as Harrogate. I was trying to get to Scotland, but we couldn't work it out. But I've gone to Harrogate, Gloucester. I've been to Norfolk, Cambridge. I've been to Rutland and Leicester. I'm even doing Sussex, where I'm from. So I've gone around the regions on purpose to listen to the members. So, and officially that was not a campaign trail. That was me going out to listen to what members had to say. And I have to say it was, one, very enjoyable. But two, one of the first observations people made is they couldn't believe I was there. They couldn't believe someone had come from the south of England to Harrogate to meet the members, to see what they're talking about. And what's interesting is you've got very, very similar conversations everywhere. And also to add to that, if you get students involved, and especially at Sheffield, they have 2 schools of architecture. When I attended an event there, it was about 25 practitioners and over 70 students. And the students are wanting to know what's going on with their education, because we're rewriting the way you study architecture. But also, how do I get a job? What's the market really like? Is it as dreadful as it sounds or not? So I think we've got people desperate to communicate with each other. And my overriding feeling is that if you've got an organization with 48,000 members, if you include the student members, that's a lot of people. If we started working together, we really could affect change. And if we listen to those members first, I think we'll do it right.
You mentioned some past RIBA presidents, Errol Current, Chris Williamson. You talk a lot about being climate literate, and I know organisations like iStruct have put climate literacy tests now into part of their membership. If you were going to set maybe past, present, and potential, your candidates a climate literacy test, what would be your first question?
Well, by the way, the RIBA is just piloting a mandatory climate literacy test. That's just gone live. So it's not just iStruct. So that's job done. I don't need to answer your question. Is that what we're saying? No. No, it's not. I just think, no, from my point of view, there are many existential sort of worries that concern humans, and obviously architects are humans. So something like the climate crisis or war or famine or biodiversity crash, whatever it is affecting all human beings. Now, the reason why it might be more important or very important for architects to engage with the climate emergency is because I think we can do something about mitigating the challenges that it impacts on humans. So in other words, to create a built environment that is climate resilient, because our climate is changing, obviously. So the built environment does not do the job it needs to do to create an affordable, equitable, low carbon place to be, then a beautiful place to be. But really, as for any president, I think you've got to understand climate literacy is understanding what the problem is and then having a good idea about whatever you happen to do, whether you're a librarian or a lorry driver or an architect, what you can do in your job to mitigate the climate and biodiversity emergency. So any president's got to put that front and center. Now, what's interesting at the moment is that one of the 4 candidates is a climate denier. So, for me, that makes the president, if that person won, they're not fit to be president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we've had these conversations before. I think architects, engineers, you have such big, footprints on the world, that you do, and climate's a massive part of that. My last quick fire question before we get into some more of the topics that really align to your manifesto is that you mentioned this already, that it's, RIBA elections historically have a very low turnout. You're talking 10%. In one sentence, why should these tired, busy, probably slightly cynical architects care about this election?
They should care because I really think if they vote me in, I can do a really good job. I think we're in a world where there's a huge positive opportunity for architects in practice to grab this opportunity that the single construction regulator, as it's formed at the moment, being formed at the moment by our government, is going to professionalize the construction sector, which includes architecture. The output from that could be part or all of what we do as architects being protected or being regulated. So that's a huge opportunity. Listen to me, because that's what's happening at the moment. Having traveled around the country, I have bumped into architects that don't know that there is this opportunity. So I think once you understand that there is an opportunity, let's get it across the line. Let's back the RIBA. Let's back me to lead the RIBA to make sure that we do get part, if not all, of the function of an architect protected. Because out of that once you're protecting the function of an architect, you're then in the world of getting better regulated fees. We can't have a scale of fees. No professional organization has an agreed scale of fees now. However, if you're not competing with other designers or people who call themselves architectural consultants for work, and I am a lot of the time, we're in a fair and equitable position where we're bidding against each other. And I think clients will see the value in what we do. And again, that's what's been really valuable with this idea of the single construction regulator. They're saying that you can only employ professional people that have done with the right sort of qualifications to do this work. Until that happens, you're looking at and you're thinking, well, if I was a graphic designer, I can do architecture, can't I? Because I can talk to AI and get it to create a nice building with me. So why not? But post Grenfell, it's irresponsible. So it's pretty much the only positive thing that's coming out of Grenfell is because of the Building Safety Act, because of the focus on getting it right and actually having responsibility as a designer, we can now professionalize what we do as architects. So we're not just protecting the name, we're protecting the function. That's why people should turn out and vote, to make sure that happens. Also, we're in a situation where I run a postgraduate architectural course. I'm only part-time and in practice as well. But when I'm teaching at the moment, we're just rewriting our courses. So, because the ARB have got rid of RIBA Part 1, we're now in a world where every school of architecture in the UK is rewriting their courses. So we have a sort of 4-year, what they call an integrated master's course that you can start when you're 18 and you'll come out the other end with Part 2, RIBA Part 2. So they're still calling it Part 2, even though there's no Part 1. It's going from 4 years down from 5. And so that sounds great because there'd be less debt for students. Good. But what about those 1,200 hours of lost education that the students might have got in year 5? So we're having to really be careful about how we rewrite this course. So as president, I don't want to be turning up into meetings around this thinking, well, I don't do teaching, but tell me about it, and then off the top of my head having a point of view, which is, by the way, where I think the RIBA is at the moment. So I want the president to be well informed when sort of rooting for students and academic staff who are going to have to deliver this new shorter course. I also want the president to know what he in my case is doing when we're thinking about protecting the function of architecture as well. In both cases, I think I'm well informed. And beyond that as well, with the other issues that impact on everyday practice, like the cost of professional indemnity insurance and all the other, think the cost of MBS spec writers or getting other consultants to write specs, all these additional costs. I feel it as a practitioner. I was speaking to a senior architect a few months ago who said, surely the whole professional indemnity insurance thing is all sorted now. It's all right now, isn't it? They were a big corporate practice or worked for a big corporate practice. I'm saying my PI's gone up 4-fold in the last 5 years. Mm. It's not an improvement. And by the way, anything before 2019 is not insured when it always was before. So it's not a good place to be. So I think that sort of accidental ignorance on the part of that person, I don't have. I'm in the thick of it, whether it's in practice or in teaching.
I completely agree. I do think there's sometimes this disconnect between the large practices, the ones with global teams, to the small regional, practices. And, where, there are some real challenges. You've talked a lot in your manifesto, but also I imagine sort of touring the country, you're hearing that there's unpredictable workloads, low fees, as you just said there, rising insurance costs, architects, notoriously have low salaries, a lot of unpaid sort of overtime as well. Through your journeys, what are people telling you maybe in private that they might not say in public?
That's a good question. I think sometimes it's about the complete lack of work. I mean, there's some real sort of empty spaces around the UK in terms of workload. I mean, touch wood, my practice happens to be busy at the moment. And I think there's a bit of that as well, is people will tell you secretly that they're very busy. I mean, I think we're slightly concerned about, and that's got to be beyond architecture. That's the thing I want to mention as well. We seem, once it goes through the sort of filter of architecture, we think all these problems are to do with our profession or our industry, but a lot of it is more existential and bigger than that. And I think unpredictable workloads because of incessant wars, and ideas around, inflation kicking in. It's got to be kicking in soon, hasn't it? With, the cost of things because of diesel prices having been elevated at over 110 pounds a barrel, with oil, etc. I think there's that sort of nervousness, but I do think that the third thing that people are whispering and sometimes saying out loud is that students are bailing after the degree. They're not wanting to finish qualifying as an architect. So they're seeing the architectural degree is really useful because it can get you into all sorts of different things. And it does. It always has been that degree. It's always been one that can serve you very well. But then they're thinking, what's the point in the extra £50,000 worth of debt or whatever to get the RIBA Part 2 to get me a job, and then I'm employed for £32,000 a year or whatever,
I've seen it as well. I've interviewed people on this podcast that were architects and are now engineers, or gone full time, or etc. It is a growing theme. Do you think maybe architects are undervaluing themselves?
I think they are. That's one thing I would say most architects I meet, or what I've met, let's stick it to this year, because I've obviously met thousands of architects because I've been doing it for so long, but this year, there's so many architects I'm meeting who are doing like 3 or 4 different things. They're really creative people. So there's been 3 occasions when I met architects who've designed their own off-site construction system that they apply to their own projects. So whether that's for issues of efficiency or sustainability or particular materials that they love, they're doing all of that. They're doing all these different, they can't help themselves. They're sort of working out problems, solving out problems all the time. And that's a characteristic. I think it might be, it's the sort of person drawn to architecture. But I think there is an appreciation that it is a bit more than just a job. We do get a lot of satisfaction at a lot of different levels. We can walk around the thing that we drew and colored in. You see what I mean? And there's a huge amount of satisfaction for that. And I think at one level, as long as we got a decent wage somehow, and the stress, and we weren't in this world of, and this is where it goes back to the RIBA. The RIBA recently published its climate literacy test. It is the pilot version of it. And immediately you're being led to a place where you can pay for more things, And I know that really upset a lot of architects. They were interested in looking at the mandatory climate literacy test, but they're then feel like they're being coerced towards paying more money. What our members really want is this one membership fee that lets you in. And once you're in, you've got all this other benefits rather than you're in, and then it's the expensive, everything's like an expensive cocktail in a nightclub, and that's paraphrasing more than one architect. But I think there's a lot of positivity for an acknowledgement that it is a lovely job to do, being able to, there's plenty of horrible jobs out there beyond our industry. So I think the sort of bemoaning the architect and the profession is a bit overplayed for me. I'm in a more of a positive place. You only have to go on site and see someone their job is bricklaying, or their job is doing polishing the screeds. It's just like, imagine doing that job.
It just seems to me though that architects always have to fight. They're fighting, for what's right. They're fighting internal pressures, external pressures. It does seem like a fight, and the amount of architects that are activists in a positive way, it's sort of inbred from the very beginning to fight for change and fight for what's right.
I do think we're taught, and and we're often the sort of people that sort of look above a situation and think, right, how can we do this better? And that's just like a normal job for us. So if you think about the designing of a building, examining a brief for site, what a client wants, and then all the stuff that goes into making a building, you're trying to sort of metaphorically sort of hover above the situation and see if you can do it better. And so I think when you're then talking about more existential issues like the climate crisis, I think we then think, well, hang on, we can mitigate that. We realize the built environment is, one of the biggest problems that the planet's got. So surely we can do something. And we're often thinking, I think as a profession, we're always thinking about systems and systems change. And that's very quickly, you can get into things like the circular economy from that. So I think we're naturally sort of a sort of wired to do that sort of thing.
It's a nice point to move on, because your campaign talks a lot about the sort of the opportunities of low carbon retrofit, and in particular circular economy, which of course, your practice is, an absolute expert on that, and yourself. But they seem to be still treated as sort of specialist interests rather than core architectural work. Do you think we're on the tipping point, Jim?
I do, in a good way. I think, certainly the RIBA's invested a lot of time publishing guidelines to encourage this way of practicing, etc., whether it's the 2030 climate challenge or whatever, or being a key partner in the development of the UK net zero carbon building standard. A standard which has been adopted by the Department for Education for its new schools program. And it's also, I know, DEFRA have taken it on board, as DESNES have, to do their draft circular economy growth plan for England and Wales, yet to be published. But so I think we're in a world where people are taking it seriously. We just don't have the legislative environment, the legislation, to support that way of practicing. I mean, we're still in a world where the government would rather pay oil procurers more money for their resource, the oil, than it would to retrofit a house. So it's easier to throw money and cap our energy bills when they get excessive than it is to spend that sort of money on transforming the built environment so it doesn't need to be plugged into that unpredictable course in the first place. So there's a mindset thing that needs to happen. I know that the current government are minded to encourage the circular economy, but there's a weird politicking going on at the moment with extreme left and right wing parties at the moment, especially the right wing ones who are, they're sort of trying to sort of tarnish the idea of low carbon anything, or what net zero in particular, that whole phrase. So I think we're primed to do. I think it's a huge opportunity, the adaptive reuse and climate resilient industry, because having done plenty of retrofit studies for local authorities for tens of thousands of homes, affordable homes, how to retrofit them, I know there isn't the money. And so why there isn't the money, it's not going to happen, because so we need to change the way we spend money, but also we need the creative industries, and in this case it's the architects, to come up with cost effective but many different sorts of solutions to different situations, different clients, briefs, programs and sites. And that's, I think it's a huge opportunity for work.
Yeah. Reading your manifesto, it's obvious. It shows how being climate literate is a real positive. It can create jobs, create opportunities, and being something the industry, needs to embrace. But you touched on it there around, especially net zero and that term now being part of that political battleground. I wonder if we need to change language. Do we need to move away from talking about net zero and carbon, because it sounds very complicated, and move it to comfort?
Yeah, I agree. It's too abstract. I think the way I've always tried to frame it, I mean, I've sort of, but often bail from the conversation when it becomes about carbon crunching, and I have to say that, when I was sitting on the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard Governance Board, my main point was we need to lose the net. And when you go, by the way, when I often go to COP, I think you mentioned that in the opening statement. So when I've gone to the UN COPs, they don't talk about net zero there. They talk about low carbon. And I agree with that. I think we've got to admit that we're going to have some sort of carbon footprint, but by trying to get it to some idea of net zero, which means doing a deal to offset somewhere, I've never believed that's a real thing. And we only went with the net zero phrase in the standard because it was what we thought people understood. But now it's been, of course, tarnished big time, and with some good reason. So I think we've just got to I think the way I like always frame it, which I feel comfortable with, is it's obvious with the inconsistent fuel prices and sort of resource security being a thing of the past because of war or whatever, or Trump's tariffs. You don't know how much a thing's going to cost by the time it gets to your building site. So I always say avoid the tariffs, avoid the oil prices, and just reuse and adapt what you already own or what's already been manufactured. So just deal with the secondhand market, and that's what you can do to a greater or lesser degree. And if you're going to do that, you've got much more cost certainty.
Yeah. Okay, I want to move you on to another really key point, I think, of your nomination statement and manifesto, which is protecting the role of the architect. And I know that, you say we need to define and regulate the professional function of architects. What's the role you're trying to protect? How are you defining the role of an architect?
That's a really good question. I think it's easiest. The easiest way of defining it is, for me, where I feel like I'm on a sort of steady, stable environment, is literally the role as described in the RIBA plan of work. So the work stages 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All those work stages are the work stages where, in my opinion, you need an architect involved. I think and this happens in France. You can't submit a planning application for an extension on a building, let alone a new building, without having a registered architect to sign off the drawings before they're submitted. So that architect is taking liability. Now, if I was going to take the liability of a design by someone that wasn't an architect, I just wouldn't do it. I'd be saying, well, I should be doing that in the first place. So I think people who aren't qualified as architects won't be submitting schemes for planning. They won't be submitting schemes for the technical design at building regulations, and they certainly won't be trying to deliver those schemes on site and sign them off as constructed properly. So I think it's really clear. If you want to, if you think, there's some very famous people in the world of architecture. Thomas Heatherwick's not an architect, but he's got a lot of architects around him who, in effect, sign off his projects. And so they're unusual because of his talent and unusual design sensibility, and perhaps because of his lack of architectural training. In his case, it's an advantage. But Thomas Heatherwick on his own in a room, he's not going to make a project that complies to the Building Safety Act. However, the fact that he's got a larger practice with qualified architects, they make sure that whatever his vision is, it's delivered as it should be. I'm talking about the practices who might be one person on their own, or 1, 2, 3, who don't even know that there's been a Building Safety Act, who don't even know what CDM is. Yeah. So, and I've actually walked onto a site next door to my own house where the contractors on site, didn't know what a principal contractor was, let alone the architectural consultant knowing what a principal designer was. So sorry, yeah. I need to get a drink of water there, but I think it's very clear the value that an architect would bring, especially when you think in terms of that architect standing in front of a judge in court if something goes wrong.
Yeah.
If you're negligent, you're going to prison now, and you can't accidentally not know. You can't be naive now. You can't say, well, I didn't know that was a thing. And if you haven't got your training, you're probably not going to know anything about the regulations around it, or not a lot anyway. And again, if you're an ARB registered architect or an RIBA chartered practice, you've got to do continual professional development, for example. You've got to do these mandatory competencies now, and that every year, and that's going to make sure you know what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, reading your presentation and the one you've been touring the country with as well at various different hustings, you've made that very clear that, that RIBA must reestablish the value of architects. How do you see it doing that?
I think it's got to shine a light on the profession more. I think it's got to be a champion more for architects, not just architecture. So at the moment, I feel like, for example, two things. One, it champions the gold medal winners, the silver medal winners, the bronze medal winners, and the awards, people that win awards. Great. But that's sort of made into an elevated first past the post thing. If they're not winning awards, maybe they're not so good, and which is rubbish. So I think there's something, the RIBA hands out money to each region every year. The regions have to apply for something called LIFT funding, which is local initiative funding. This funding goes towards local chapters doing events with community groups, whatever. Could be exhibitions, could be charity runs, whatever it is. And that's an amazing work. And it's done at a really sort of micro, hyper local level. It's brilliant. And again, I've seen a lot of that work over the last few months. RIBA makes nothing of it. You can't read about this stuff. It mentions it at council once a year when the person in charge of it has to read through some of the 150 events that have happened all year that no one knows about. I want to promote that. I want to start with the everyday, because I want people to realize that the everyday architect is actually really good. Multi-talented people who can organize all sorts of different things, and we're engaging with our local communities. Now, when I'm president, what I'd like to do is spend more money on that LIFT funding, more money on the region. So I compare it, and I think I actually said it in the first podcast we did. While Portland Place, the headquarters in London, is being retrofitted, and it's going to be closed down for another 3 or 4 years. While that's happening, I'd like the funding that would have gone there for big events to sort of be distributed every sort of 4, 5, 6 months to different regions. So it was a bit like when the FA, the Football Association, were rebuilding Wembley. Suddenly you got Newcastle hosting the World Cup games or whatever it was. You see what I mean? So suddenly you get the proper funding and the proper big events in the world of architecture being in the region. So the Southwest would hold the Sterling Prize or whatever, but it wouldn't just be the Sterling Prize. It'd have more money to shine a light on the everyday. I think if we do that, people will realize that the average architect is worth employing, not just the best in the world.
Well, you made that comment earlier, I think, about the sort of, the large practice holder, wasn't aware of the cost of, personal indemnity insurance. They're probably not aware of the cost of a RIBA membership either, but a sole practitioner like yourself is evidently aware of the cost of it. And quite a lot of your commitments also focus on those cost savings. I know you want cost-effective access to the MBS specification writer, you want fairer personal indemnity insurance, you want affordable entry routes to specify registers, and you've just been talking about it quite a lot there, the sort of stronger regional funding. I think that's all getting to the point that RIBA really needs to show the value of itself, doesn't it, to those smaller practices?
I think, again, RIBA could. Well, I have to say that I think I'm about to have one success. I've got a meeting next week, which is a launch of a LCA life cycle analysis app via a spec writer, big, very famous spec writing company, who are rolling out, apparently, a cost-effective version of the life cycle analysis app for small practitioners. So I've been lobbying that within the RIBA in my role as chair of the Climate Emergency Expert Advisory Group. So I'm hoping that's a win. But that's the sort of thing I think the RIBA should be able to go to, have commercial partnerships and just say, if you want to deal with our 48,000 members, you're going to have to reduce your spec writer from $6,000 a year to something more affordable. And by the way, wouldn't it make commercial sense to you to do that? Because we're the gateway to all these members. And I don't think we do enough of that. And I don't know why. I mean, obviously the RIBA years ago sold off the MBS spec for £110 million or something. So it does know how to do commercial business.
Yes.
And I really just think we should make more of the fact that we are a large group of people needing apps, needing spec writers, needing insurance, all these things. And I think that's where I say the RIBA should be more about the architects rather than architecture. It's doing amazing things with the idea of an architecture museum and the millions of artifacts in its collection. Great, that's amazing work. That's sort of ongoing legacy stuff. Meanwhile, if the actual people paying their membership fees are sort of withering for because they're either bored, can't, with the RIBA, can't see the worth in it or can't afford it in the first place. That's the big problem. There's only, I think it got better this year than last year, but I think the report at recent council meeting was that 55% of qualified architects were members of the RIBA. If it gets below 50, what's the point of the RIBA? You're looking at the ARB to have to be a member of the ARB. So my ambition is to, during the time I'm president, is to raise membership by 10%. And people say, well, what, you can't do that in 10 years. But sorry, I could do it in 10 years. You can't do that in 2 years. And I say it's not just 2 years, because if I'm successful, I'll be president-elect for 1 year, then 2 years as president, and then another year where I sit on the board and council. So it's a 4-year gig, really. And in that time, I'll just keep banging on about making the RIBA for architects, not just architecture.
I want to move it on to something that's extremely close to your heart, which is education, and really inspiring that next generation of architects to come through. And obviously, you're a lecturer yourself, and it's been hugely in the news at the moment, the spiraling debt of students going into higher education.
Yeah,
we've also got a massive skills gap across the construction industry. We need to almost bring in the next generation of architects, engineers, designers. One of your big calls is that we need to make it more modern, inclusive, and affordable. What does it actually look like in practice?
Yeah, I chair an industry advisory board for architecture for the University of Brighton, which means we've got people on the board that are not within the university community, from outside, from industry. And so we meet 4 times a year and just trying to answer the question, what should we be teaching? How should we be teaching it? And then what do employers want? And obviously we're in this hugely exciting time where AI is kicking in, sort of, but also that is informing how we're going to be teaching architecture. And we've now got to look at an integrated master's that takes people coming out of 6th form colleges with their A levels on a 4-year course, and at the other end of it, they've got RIBA Part 2. So we are redesigning, and every school of architecture in the country is doing the same. We're redesigning our courses right now so they're ready for autumn 2027. So we're looking at keeping a degree in architecture pretty much as it is, because as we referred to earlier, a lot of students are finding the architecture degree useful. So there might be students that know that they don't want, or think they don't want to be a professional architect, but they want an architecture degree to get them into something else. So we're probably going to keep that. But the brand new news is we're going to have a 4-year integrated master's. So during those 4 years, we've got to do what normally takes 5 years. And we're looking at doing that by encouraging more apprenticeship schemes. And despite what the government's not funding the level 7 ones, which is at Part 2, but also part-time courses, and allowing our students to go from part-time to full-time, depending on their employment situation. So a lot more flexibility during the course of study. And we're looking at the moment, the idea of involving industry from level 4, which is 18-year-olds onwards. So instead of doing professional practice later on as a sort of into Part 2, Part 3 thing, we're looking at, because the ARB, their new rules are you don't have to have done a certain amount of time in practice. You have to have proved that you've met certain competencies in practice. So if you're a genius, it might only take you 3 weeks, but you've got to demonstrate those competencies. So we're thinking, well, why don't we partner local practices or regional practices and get them involved all the way through those 4 years? And that's another way of getting a lot done in less time, and students having even less debt because they might have done their second year part-time or something. I've been interviewing students for our normal master's course for this autumn, and I've had 2 now who have done the undergraduate part-time and they want to do postgraduate part-time because they don't want any debt. Students now, they're really seeing the debt as debt. It's not an abstract thing. They've been convinced it's this abstract thing. Well, since the current government have reduced the threshold for when you start paying back, everybody's paying back their loans pretty quickly. And what's interesting is one of the candidates running for president, she's still paying back her loan now. So, she's running for president. So it's not a clever thing. So we're looking at what are we teaching? How can we do it in a shorter amount of time? But how can the quality stay up? And I think, I've heard students say they're concerned about the reduction in the length of time. But I know, having taught a lot in undergraduate and postgraduate, that we double up at the moment. We do stuff in the undergraduate that then gets done again in the postgraduate. So we've got room to reduce that 5 years down to 4. And that excites me.
Yeah. Duncan, I'm going to finish. We could talk for hours, and we always do. But I'm going to finish on some more quick-fire questions for you. I think the first one is, I'd like, Chris Williamson's been in post for a year and a half, coming up to his 2 years there. What has he done well and that you generally want to build on?
I think he's communicated that there is this practice of architecture rather well, to be honest. I think people know, I think he's out there all the time. I think he's doing quite a good comms job. And he has championed the idea of protecting the level 7 apprenticeship scheme, which the government is trying to shelve at the moment. So there's a campaign to sort of keep that, because that's where we'd have RIBA Part 2 apprentices. He's also he's shone a light on the idea that we need to protect the function or regulate the function by taking a pop at the ARB for not doing a better job. And so he's also, by throwing in the towel with the ARB personally with himself by not renewing his membership, that got journalists and people interested. What's this all about? And then asking questions like, how can if you're not a member of the ARB, you're not a registered architect, you're not an architect, how can you be president of the RIBA? But apparently you can, but I'm still not sure. So he's got people talking about these important issues, which is a really good thing to do. It's applaudable. And he's done it with some grace, I think. We've now got an RIBA campaign to get rid of the ARB. I think that's slightly ridiculous, really, because from my point of view, you've got the government coming up with a single construction regulator. And within that, one little bit of it is architecture. And then when you look into the architecture, the ARB and the RIBA are having a little scrap. And by the way, the ARB are the government quango, is the government's department dealing with architecture. So which side's it going to be on? Its own department, I think. And it's going to wonder why the RIBA are going for the ARB. I think it's wasting energy. I think we've got to work together to make sure that our function is as protected as it can be. And if we're having a scrap, we're wasting energy, which we should be focusing on that. So I don't think that's a good idea.
I'd say all too often now in modern politics, there's a lot of sort of, criticism of other candidates, people, throwing mud at each other, etc. We see it in Prime Minister's Question Time, in the House of Commons. I'm sure the RIBA hustings aren't as bad as that. However, I'm sure you've come up with some criticism from the other candidates. Being frank, what would you say is the sort of, what criticism of you is fair?
Criticism of me is fair.
Yeah. What do you like? They're saying that and you go, fair enough, that is what I stand for.
Well, I think at the moment, as one of the candidates is a climate denier, I think the observation, this is hypothetical because they haven't said it to me to my face, but I can imagine they're thinking I'm wasting energy and resources and time bleating on about the climate emergency and our response to it, rather than it's all going to be all right. Can't we just carry on and look like we're going to be less complicated to our clients by ignoring it? I think there's that side of it. I mean, the other thing is, in my manifesto statement, I refer to the need for architects to be braver. And a lot of people have said, so it's not so much the candidates that said this, it's been journalists have said, what do you mean braver? Why do architects need to be braver? And I think it's about keeping true to our identity and what we believe in. And that it's not what I believe in, it's what you believe in as an architect. Being authentic, the authentic voice is the one that's going to get heard, because I know inauthentic voices and untruths are being told all the time. But I think when you're trying to deliver something as important as a transformed built environment, you need to believe in what you're doing, because very difficult to do it. And if you're doing it in a unauthentic way, you're going to fall foul. And it was one thing one I don't often get shocked, but one thing I was a bit shocked about was an article in one of the architecture magazines recently, which talked about a new airport in Washington, DC, a new terminal, and the UK practices that were bidding for the work. And one of the practices had decided to name the terminal the Donald J. Trump terminal, even though that wasn't part of the brief. And another practice promised that if they were selected, they would make airports great again. That's the opposite of being a brave architect.
Yeah.
If you're an architect at that scale and you're knocking out international airports and railway infrastructure, you don't need to stoop as low as that.
I think the problem is that maybe in America and that political environment, you do, to succeed. And that's the sad state, I think, of what's happening over there. Anyway, my last question for you, Duncan, and this is a sort of a future gazing piece. And it's sort of, when you win or if you win, what do you want architects to say changed because of Duncan Baker-Brown becoming RIBA president?
I want more of them to be members of the RIBA because it makes sense to be members of the RIBA. And I want more of them to be working with students and students students are members as well. But I want more opportunities for practitioners and students to work together, whether that's students doing their undergraduate or postgraduate studies part-time and working in practice, or meeting each other more often. I think there are too many, this is quite a small thing, but there are too many regional events for architects that don't include students. There are many that do, but I think it should be an automatic thing. I've got a little, I have half a feeling this is going to happen, but it's something I've been lobbying for in the past, in the background. I'm hoping that the RIBA is going to continue to give free membership to students. That's going to be a thing, but I'm hoping it's going to give free membership to architects who are academics. Because at the moment, if you're a full-time academic, you are almost definitely not a member of the RIBA. And if you think that the RIBA are validating your course and you're trying to teach students in a more onerous, litigious environment to be architects, I think we need to engage with our academics. And I think to get them engaged, first of all, to have a sort of let them be free members for a bit and get used to the environment that we've got. That for me is a victory.
Yeah. Duncan, I want to thank you for your time. I think for me, the sort of standout point here is that only 10% of people turn out for this election. And however, architects are some of the most opinionated people I've ever met. They're activists that fight for the right thing. And I think, I personally urge everyone listening to this, if you're an architect, to get out there and vote and get your practice to vote and get your colleagues to vote and get your peers to vote. Because, Duncan, as you said, this is their moment. They need to take it. So this will be out around the sort of 10th, 11th. What's the timeline of things? What do people need to know?
They need to know that they can start voting on June the 15th and they've got until June the 26th. So for me, we do the general election, the political one, in a day. But the RIBA president needs 11 days. But anyway, goes live on the 15th. Just vote. And by the way, if you are voting, you'll be asked to do first, second, third, fourth. Please fill in everybody in the order, your preference and your second preference, because Chris Williamson got in last time on the number of second voters he got compared with me. So those votes all the way through, they do matter.
If I'm an architect, I'd be shocked if this is the case and they go, I don't even know how to vote. How do they vote?
Oh, watch out for an email. If you remember, you'll be getting an email direct from the RIBA and it will give you a link to the voting site. Also, check out my social media, my LinkedIn, my Instagram, #DBB for president. Oh, sorry, can't even get that right. #DBB for RIBA president 26.
Brilliant.
You'll find out.
Thank you, Duncan. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Martin. It's been a pleasure as ever. See you soon.